Hello, welcome to today's webinar on practical data governance and protection. This one's entitled Building the Framework. So today we'll have myself, James Mace, Principal Consultant at WM Reply, and I'll be joined by Rob Parle, a Senior M365 Consultant out of our Chester office, and we'll be presenting to you today this second webinar. So in the first webinar, in the series, we covered the definitions of risk and compliance. We also talked about the definition of data governance, and we looked at the importance of data governance to mitigate risk and data loss and everything associated with that is or can be quite a big issue, as it can lead to fines and settlements and even bankruptcy. So if you want to catch up on that webinar, that is available on our WM YouTube channel. Search WM Reply on YouTube. And today we're going to dive into a framework, or defining the framework. So what do we mean by framework, right? So in this context, it's really about a structured approach to data governance, okay? Ensuring that all aspects of data management are all systematically addressed, right? It involves assigning clear ownership, making sure people are responsible for data risk and compliance tasks, and that often means across different departments and groups within your organization. Rob's going to take us through that in a little bit. And we also want to make sure that it aligns to broader business goals and that sort of thing. And at the end of the day, it's really about a structured approach to data governance. So what we're going to look at in today's talk is the risk, who owns the risk and compliance, and the role of that ownership. So Rob's going to take us through both those sections. And this is key, and it can be a little bit complex because oftentimes it's not just one person or one department, it's often many. And then I'll take us through the platform governance and an overview of Microsoft Purview as a possible tool that you can use to implement a governance framework. And then we'll take a little look at how AI and Copilot can help out with some of the tools within Microsoft Purview. And then we'll let you know what's coming up in the third webinar, which is about looking to the future and maintenance and that sort of thing. Right. Just about to hand over to Rob, but before I do, be sure to drop any questions that you have in the Q&A of this meeting, and we'll address those at the end. Rob, over to you.
Thank you, James. So, right, take control. So, as you say, I'm going to start off with talking about who owns risk and compliance, and some parts of this were mentioned in our first webinar, so we're going to try and talk in a little bit more detail about the different teams and roles throughout the organization. So to start off with, what is the role of leadership? Because inevitably, if leadership isn't on board from the start, from a data governance perspective, then it can become something of a checklist exercise or something that people like to kind of avoid entirely. So the role of leadership is really about trying to set the tone throughout the business, because when leaders can establish clear expectations for things like data governance, that might be through policies, strategic direction, or just consistently talking about the importance of something like data governance and data protection, it can then send a pretty strong message throughout the business that we are trying to take this seriously. So this isn't just about messaging, it's also about trying to show that commitment as well. So if leaders really have to model those behaviors themselves, as for example, if the leadership team are cutting corners when it comes to things like handling data or compliance, then naturally other people within the business will follow suit. So we also can't underestimate the impact that leadership can have in creating a culture of accountability as well. So as I've just stated, when team members are seeing managers, genuinely engaged in governance conversations and not just delegating them to other members within that team, then they are more likely to try and take that seriously. And lastly, if leadership is setting those policies and procedures that then form that foundation of governance as well. And what that can really do is it can make a difference to show how those are communicated and lived as well. Governance isn't just a policy document that's sitting somewhere in a shared space. It's all about sort of trying to weave all those policies and practices into place into how an organization runs every day, and then through that can be embedded throughout the business. So we've just talked about what happens when the leadership team is engaged, but that next critical step is trying to define and then also assign ownership. Because if governance isn't a part of, specific teams' roles, then it can end up becoming nobody's role actually. So when we talk about ownership, we're trying to understand, accountability, but also transparency as well. People need to know what they're being held responsible for. So there's clarity that can then reduce things like confusion. It can make it easier to track, progress, but also a key metric is that it can also help us understand if there are gaps in things like knowledge or also capacity. Do we have the capacity in our teams to, manage certain areas of data governance? But then also data governance and that ownership can also improve things like decision making as well. If someone owns a data set or a business area, they can then become empowered to make decisions about things like access or retention, data classification, especially if they have that added business context. And then through this, things can move quicker, and we can avoid something like a long approval process when people that are managing that data or those governances aren't aware of the business context or what that data could involve. Also, we need to consider risk mitigation. Without clear ownership of certain data governance practices, then naturally risks can slip through the cracks. So with ownership in place, people are more likely to spot, potentially escalate issues earlier, before they can become real problems that could have, potentially direct or large impacts. It can also help with compliance as well. Most regulations don't just ask what you're doing, but they also want to know who's responsible for doing it as well. So when that comes to things like audits, having a clear line of responsibility can make things, much more straightforward, in the future. And then finally, if we have, those clear roles and ownership, it can then allow a consistent implementation, throughout the organization. If we have clear owners, then our policies don't get applied in one way by a team in a certain business unit and in a completely different way by a team in a different business unit. If we can try and get that unified approach, then we can have a really it can be a crucial sort of stepping stone for a very mature governance framework going forward. And then moving on to creating a culture of accountability. So now we have our leadership on board. We've started to define that ownership, but to make that really stick and to really land, we need to try and create and sustain a culture that supports accountability throughout the business. So first, that might mean setting really clear expectations. It's not enough to say, James, you're the shared space owner. What does that actually mean for James? Does that mean that he needs to manage the permissions? Does he need to approve things like sharing requests? Does he need to classify what type of documents exist within his shared space? We need to spell it out clearly for those owners of that data so that they are, in the clear and are very transparent about what they are being held accountable for. With that, we then need to make sure that we are providing those people with the right tools and the right support. So that might mean training, it might mean access to certain guidance materials, it could even mean providing a community for people like James for them to then tap into for support and advice. We need to have our colleagues feeling confident, but also equipped, with the right information. And then through that, they will then become far more likely to engage and follow the correct guidelines set throughout the business. And also we want to try and foster that environment of responsibility as well. And that's when that sort of culture really starts to come in. Can we identify, really strong and, good behavior in following those policies? Can we try to share stories of really proactive ownership? But also creating a space for people to raise their concerns and all of that, we can try and put those pillars in place. We can then really try to build that trust and engagement throughout the organization. Again, as we alluded to before, leadership plays a really big role in here too. If we can try and allow that leadership team to communicate the why behind the governance, can we let our colleagues know that it isn't just about red tape, it's about trying to protect, our work, our customers, the entire organization. If we can try and get teams involved to see themselves as part of that solution, then hopefully they will appreciate that this isn't just a sort of a tick box exercise, as I alluded to earlier. And then finally, what's the payoff here? What are the benefits of having a culture of accountability? Well, hopefully what we will see is that we will try to foster that culture where things like data integrity is maintained. And that's not just because people are being policed and being told you have to do X, Y, and Z, but because they believe that and they understand what their roles are and that they can try to apply their learnings appropriately. And then that's what we can hopefully then start to see a real, self-sustainable, potentially, data governance framework in place. So talked a little bit about sort of the roles of leadership there and the importance of that ownership. Let's try to then understand how do we start assigning those responsibilities as well. So first of all, let's try and understand, what could ownership look like on a day-to-day? Can we assign responsibilities across data, risk, and compliance? This isn't just a nice to have. This is, in our opinion, absolutely essential. If we can have these areas clearly defined and clearly owned, we then have that framework has a real structure in place. It can ensure that there's someone keeping an eye on things and can step in when it's needed, rather than us assuming that someone has something covered but potentially they don't. So to break it down, we have sort of three sort of key areas of ownership here. First off, we have data ownership, and that's usually handled by what you might call sort of a data steward or a data manager. It's their job to ensure that the data is accurate, it's complete, and it's usable. They are, as I mentioned before, they might have that business context, they understand the systems, the types of data that exist, and they would then be responsible for making sure that it's being maintained properly. We then have our risk ownership. This often would lie within your cybersec teams, your cybersecurity teams, or potentially designated risk officers within the business. They're trying to maybe look ahead, look in the future. Can they try to anticipate potential vulnerabilities in the systems that we're using, in the type of data that we use, and trying to put in place certain mitigation strategies as well? It's potentially, sort of their role is about the response, but it's just as much about that prevention as well. And then finally, that third team in terms of ownership will be the compliance. So this, role usually falls for our compliance officers or like potentially our governance leads, and they're focused on trying to ensure that our policies align with that more of a legal side and the regulatory requirements that fit within our business. And then that way, then is followed throughout the organization consistently and throughout as well. So the real key sort of item here is really clarity. If we have clear responsibilities, but if they are vague, and as stated before, if they aren't clear and transparent throughout those certain teams, then things can of course slip through and gaps can appear. But if people are aware and are very understanding of what they own, then of course we can get better visibility, we can get that stronger control, and then when responses are needed, then we'd hope to see quicker action from their clearly defined teams. So now let's try to talk about, can we make governance meaningful? So just because governance doesn't support the business, people can think it can become a burden. So there are, potential ways that we can think of it as a sort of a fruitious endeavor. Potentially one of the steps there could be maybe a strategic alignment as well. That could mean taking your data governance policies and making sure that they support the business for what the business is trying to achieve, let's say. If we have a business that's trying to grow into new markets potentially, then our governance teams would need to support that. That might involve, can we ensure that we have cross-border data handling processes in place and not potential risks that we might, identify when it's potentially too late. But then also through our data governance efforts, we could try to align those with our KPIs, key performance indicators, something like data quality or even operational efficiency. We can find that data governance can actually directly influence both of these and then even tie them to measurable outcomes that could then help us justify things like the time and the investment involved to get that proper data governance framework in place. and of course then increasing that buy-in throughout the business. And then finally, there also could be, a pretty big opportunity for resource optimization if we can focus on initiatives that can, drive business value for our colleagues, something like improving the reliability of our data, something like a decision making. We can then make that governance discussion part of those growth conversations and not just that side project, that tick box exercise we've mentioned before. So finally, let's talk about a really important dynamic, and that's trying to balance oversight with empowerment. I've talked about trying to put in those sort of policies and those sort of ways to keep our colleagues engaged and in the know. But however, if we can have too much oversight, then we could potentially create that culture of micromanagement. However, if we apply too little of that oversight, then we could find that things may fall through the cracks. So how do we strike the right balance? First off, can we start with that empowerment? It's giving people the tools and the training that they need to manage their own data responsibly. If they don't understand the why, they don't understand how they should be doing that, then how can we expect them to act responsibly? And then after that, we can then layer in that oversight. It's using monitoring tools that are available within our systems. Can we review those mechanisms, but not to try and punish our colleagues for where they may have made mistakes, but to try to identify where can we provide support. We're not trying to catch mistakes and highlight those for those individuals, but trying to then instead find opportunities where we can improve throughout those teams. So we think, when you get those balances right, we're not just enforcing compliance, we're trying to enable our colleagues to do the right thing. And that's through that we can find that governance will become a part of our culture and not just a controlling mechanism that we'd use throughout the business. So back over to yourself, James, for some platform governance. You just unmute, James.
Oh, thank you for that, Rob. Helps if I not only take over the presentation, but turn myself off mute. All right, so the next couple sections that I'm going to take us through kind of fall into two broad pillars, okay? One of them is going to be actually looking at a tool, Microsoft Purview, and how it can kind of build a framework using Purview. And while that won't be a deep dive or a how-to, I'm not going to show you Purview in today's session. We're going to talk about its capabilities and how we can align that to building a framework. But before we talk about that, we're going to talk about what I like to call platform governance, okay? And this is really sort of taking everything that Rob just talked about and kind of putting it into a plan and a strategic framework, right? So we want that in place because we want that strategic framework. We want to ensure effective management. We want to have oversight. We want optimization. And it's going to encompass a lot of the policies, maybe even some processes and procedures and responsibilities that Rob talked about, and defining how the platform is administered. Okay, who's accountable for certain aspects, and also how it aligns to the organization's broader goals, which Rob talked about as well. So this is really about a couple different things. So one of them is a governance model, right? An ownership governance model of data governance, right? Sounds a bit sort of redundant saying governance that many times, but it's governance model of data governance. So what does that mean? It means all of those things like role definition that Rob talked about, right? Making sure each role is involved. In a small organization, that might be one team or maybe even one person. But as the organization grows, you are likely to have separate teams for legal, for cybersec, for data, all kind of involved in owning bits and pieces. And they might not own the whole thing. So you may put together a governance model that has a board, for example, of representatives from each of those teams, all responsible for platform governance. Now, as a side note, that can make it a little bit tricky to sort of figure out if you're trying to find budget to implement a governance strategy and a framework and actually deploy some procedures and labels and all that kind of stuff, which we'll talk about in a bit. But that's the sort of thing that we can kind of help you with when we plan out this platform governance. Excuse me. It also outlines accountability, which Rob already talked about, right? Additionally, it might go into things like monitoring and reporting, so that you have regular monitoring, you have reporting mechanisms, so you can kind of track how effective your governance is within the organization, right? And then, like I said, policies, predominantly policies in the governance model, but then you might have some actual procedures as to how those are implemented, and so that they're consistent across the platform. And they're pretty essential to have both, obviously, because you're going to want those procedures to formalize steps and actions required to apply governance policies consistently, right? So this is one aspect, right, of this sort of platform governance, right? It's kind of cementing all that ownership, rulers, roles, accountability into a model. And then another aspect is a bit of strategic planning that goes along with this, right? So strategic planning sets clear objectives, again, aligns governance strategy with long-term business goals, right? This is coming up multiple times now. It's a very important thing to make sure these things align. You want clear objectives so that you can have precise and measurable goals. And now I'm repeating myself again, but it's important, aligning with business goals, right? So this is the sort of thing that you take a look at, maybe a 3-year or 5-year plan to really identify what components you might be doing. Are you going to tackle like information protection or retention or compliance communication or various different aspects of data governance? When are you going to do those? Do you need additional licensing? Do you need additional tooling? All of that kind of stuff kind of mapped out over time. And then it makes that a bit easier to break down into phases to tackle phase by phase, which would be our recommendation as to how you actually implement that plan. And lastly, on the platform governance side of things, as you begin to roll out, let's say your phase 1 or your first, set of implementation of whatever it is within Purview, which we'll talk about in a minute, you're going to want to look at kind of two things. One is sort of adoption and change management, or ACM, right, which is training your users, making sure they have the right tools. Some governance tooling works behind the scenes. So some things users don't see. They just maybe need to be aware that there is something that has data under retention, for example, but maybe they never interact with it. In other cases, it's pretty front and center in their face. They might be asked to assign a label directly on a document that they're working on, or to an email within Outlook, for example. So there is a bit of a training aspect to be aware of here. And then there's also a support model that's going to be required, right, for this sort of platform governance. And that tends to be fairly broad, because that's not just defining, who's responsible within your, tier 1, 2, and 3 support teams, but it can vary from users maybe having issues trying to figure out what labels they need, or what they should be doing, or if something's broken, but then also all kinds of other things like triaging alerts and risk alerts and all that kind of stuff that maybe comes up from notifications within the tools themselves. So there's quite a broad set of stuff to sort of be aware of to support the platform, if you will. Okay, so that's basically the 3 main categories, if you will, kind of a support model, governance model, strategic planning, that you're going to want to look at as the platform as a whole. And again, that is where a lot of the stuff that Rob talks about comes in, assigning those roles and accountability, and fostering, an environment that allows everyone else to feel like they're empowered to assist and do data governance without being too much of a burden on end users, which is one of the last things that Rob talked about. Okay, so the second pillar, if you will, if we talk about the platform and governance, now we're going to talk about the actual what is it? What are you doing? What is data governance? How do you sort of implement it? What does it mean? All that kind of stuff. We've been talking sort of a bit high level up until now. We're going to go a bit deeper. Again, this isn't show you how to use Purview, so it's still one level above that. But we're going to look at how Microsoft Purview can be used to kind of implement a data governance framework. Okay, So what is Purview? Purview is a comprehensive end-to-end data governance solution, right? It's Microsoft tooling, but it doesn't just focus on your M365 data in your tenant. It can do structured and unstructured data, but it can also look at helping you manage your data that might be on-premise or in other clouds. So there are sort of hybrid scenarios that it can help you with. So let's take a little bit of a deeper look at how Purview could help with data governance and some of the key capabilities. Excuse me. One of the main overarching concepts within Purview is really all about data discovery and classification. And that comes out in a couple of different ways, which we'll get into as we go here. But that's often meaning applying labels, figuring out where your data is in the first place, right? Is it unstructured data sitting in SharePoint? Is it on a file share? Is it in a database? Where is all your data? And what do you need to do with it, right? And of course, we're always going to want to refer to the governance policy, the governance model that we just talked about, and we'll come back to that sort of when we talk about how we maybe implement some of this, right? So continuing on with the capabilities of Purview, one of the core things is data lifecycle management. Okay, so this is all about retention, retaining data. Often you need to retain data for a certain amount of time. Too long might not be good. Too short might not be good. You might also need to use e-discovery tools to put data on hold. There's a litigation case, for example, and then maybe when that hold is cleared, it goes back to normal retention. There are ways to do retention where it's a little behind the scenes and users don't really know that it's happening, or perhaps with retention labels where users do maybe need a bit of training and be aware to classify their content. Then you look at information protection and DLP. These are more related to kind of like security and obviously in the word information protection. So these are things like sensitivity labels and DLP, which is data loss prevention, if you're not sure what that means. And so this is where you can apply labels to content that puts encryption on it, maybe secures it to the right audience, prevents it from getting into other people's hands. Data loss prevention is really about making sure content isn't accidentally shared outside or inside the organization, for that matter. Things like sensitive data, like credit cards, addresses, PII information, all of that kind of stuff. It can kind of track that maybe someone's sending an email with a bunch of credit card information and about to leave the organization, and make sure that that doesn't happen. Right. There are other components within Purview. Again, we're not sort of looking at everything that it does, but it can do things like privacy compliance. It can do communication compliance. I did mention e-discovery already. There's also insider risk management. We'll touch on some of those a little later on, but that's broadly the capabilities within Purview. So now we want to look at what do we do? Where do we start? Right. So this section here is probably the crux of this whole webinar. This is about implementing that data governance framework. And we're going to look at it in the lens of Microsoft Purview, although you might be using other tooling, but a lot of the language is probably similar around retention and sensitivity and that kind of stuff. But our first stage is to assess and plan, right? Map out your data landscape. Again, where is your data? Is it structured, unstructured, all that kind of stuff? And then looking at defining those governance objectives aligning with your business goals, which I've said numerous times now. That is all about really making sure everything's aligned moving forward when you go to actually implement the various components within Purview. And to refine that even further, defining those policies and models. If you've already done your platform governance, chances are you've already created a governance model, and in there you may have already established some labeling schemes, maybe retention schedules for retention-based information. You probably have created escalation paths for policy enforcement and anything else that might need to be triaged through, because of an incident or a user that needs help, right, through the support model. So all of that gets all really refined in this point and defined as policies. And then we move on to deploying and integrating, right? This is really the crux of actually deploying this into Purview, right? Setting up those labels. It's probably advisable to do this in phases, is often a good approach to do this, because there's so much capability within Purview. That would be a lot to throw at your teams to build and deploy, but it would also be a lot to throw at your users, right? So breaking this down into phases. You can then train appropriate teams on what they need to do, whether it's apply a label or maybe use a provisioning portal or whatever it is that you're implementing. And of course, this all aligns with the strategic plan that we talked about in the governance platform, because maybe you do sensitivity, then you do DOP, then you do retention, or maybe some run in parallel. Maybe you need to wait until certain licenses are available before you can do a certain component, and that sort of thing. And then lastly, monitor and evolve. We talked about this very briefly, but basically it's that sort of continuously measure adoption from your users. There's even things to think about, like consider like changing compliance out there in the world. Now we're going to do a third webinar in this series that talks a little bit more about how to manage that and what the future looks like in maintenance and monitoring and that kind of stuff. So we'll leave that topic for the third webinar, but just to touch on it, so that's part of this complete picture here. It's certainly part of that framework. So yeah, this is really where all of this sort of starts to come together, right? By doing assessments, defining policies, and then deploying in phases, Purview in phases, right? Excuse me. Okay, so last section that we're going to look at is we're just going to touch on a little bit of how Copilot and AI have kind of changed the landscape a little bit within Purview. So there's new tools such as Copilot Security that's available within Microsoft Purview. And this shows up in a couple of different flavors, because you're either using Copilot as a tool to help you with your data discovery or e-discovery or whatever it is, or it's almost like another data source, not almost, it is another data source that has arisen, and you might need to put Copilot data like prompts and that kind of stuff on hold or under retention, or assign policies to that content itself, kind of thing, right? So this kind of breaks down into sort of two categories as to when we talk about Copilot and how we're using it. So let's look at a few examples of how Copilot can make this a little bit easier to manage. So one of the components, again, we haven't dived into this one too much. I did mention it a few minutes ago, but a big component of Purview is insider risk management. And it's good at detecting unusual data or activity, user or data activity, actually. It helps prevent things like data breaches, can provide real-time alerts and all that kind of stuff. And where Copilot comes in specifically is often with insider risk management, your admin teams have to deal with a lot of alerts, right? Especially the larger organization you are, or maybe the more litigious you are. The more alerts there are, the harder it is for a human to really get a sense of what's happening and is there a risk. And you might look at it in a bit of silos and not be aware of other things going on. And so Copilot has really come in. So security Copilot has come in and being able to summarize and prioritize alerts that need further investigation. It's also pretty handy to consolidate information about a user from all their different alerts. And so it's really about using Copilot in this context to kind of like summarize, contextualize, consolidate, and make it easier for people to realize what's going on and respond to it and then mitigate that risk. Okay. Next example is communication compliance. This is kind of a flip. This is an example of the other example that I mentioned at the start of this. So communication compliance is all about scanning emails, chat platforms, looking for keywords, looking for compliance issues. And in this example, communication for compliance could be something like bullying, harassment, that kind of stuff. The tooling supports all of that sort of scanning and compliance and all that kind of stuff and reporting. And where Copilot comes in isn't so much yet on the helping you work with that data, although I'm sure that's likely coming, but in this context, It's more about looking at users' interactions with Copilot. So their prompts and Copilot's responses in Teams, BizChat, Outlook, all your applications where Copilot shows up, and having communication compliance monitor that form of data as well. So not just your emails, not just your chats, but Copilot interactions, looking for any kind of compliance issues, bullying and all that kind of stuff that might show up in there, and being able to flag, compliance violations off the chain. All right, another example is advanced e-discovery. So this is advanced e-discovery is simplifying the discovery process, machine learning algorithms to pinpoint relevant data. It enhances efficiency and all this kind of great stuff. But where Copilot really comes in, Security Copilot allows you to summarize an entire review set of data, as well as documents, meeting transcripts, attachments, right? Really the whole group of content that you might get out of a review set. A review set is sort of a slice of information that an e-discovery manager might pull out of reviewing a bunch of data for a potential case or hold, either stuff that already is on hold or maybe trying to decide if they should put something on hold for a litigation case. And often that can be quite large data sets. And so if you have a tool like Copilot, you can look at using that to summarize that review set and make it a bit easier to manage, kind of speed up the time, reduces some of the time needed for manual review, and just helps overall with compliance and legal processes. Excuse me. Okay. Lastly, we'll look at two other aspects where Copilot can come in, and that's DSPM, which is Data Security Posture Management, and DLP, which we talked about, Data Loss Prevention. These are separate tools and large tools in and of themselves, and we haven't talked about this too much. In fact, this is probably the first time that I'm mentioning the DSPM aspect. But both of these tools have Copilot security available for them to suggest or allow you to customize prompts, and allows you to obtain information regarding unprotected sensitive data assets, or maybe hazardous user actions. And it basically can ensure that you're dynamically maybe applying DLP policies based on risk signals. Security Copilot can help triage alerts and drill down into your data in the case of DLP policies. And so really it's an extra set of tools, like we've seen in a few other examples, where Security Copilot can help you kind of summarize, assess, drill down, and really get to the bottom of like what's happening, right? So it could be user behavior, data behavior, and really you want to try to minimize disruption as much as possible. And so sometimes these things are applied automatically based on real-time risk assessment and all that kind of stuff. Okay. So that brings us to the end of our talk today. There's a little bit of a wrap up, and I'll summarize kind of what we've been talking about, and then we do have the next webinar. So if you do have any questions, be sure to throw them into the Q&A in this webinar. And so just to recap a little bit, we talked about roles and responsibilities, accountability, and figuring out how that works across your platform governance, right? So defining those roles, who owns it, what the responsibilities are, looking at a governance model, support model, strategic planning, all of that kind of stuff. And then the actual like implementation, looking at a framework of like planning, assessing, defining policies, and implementing those within Purview in kind of a phased approach. We also looked at a little bit about how Copilot can help you within Purview to do a few management tasks in there and help make things a bit more efficient and easier to work with. And then in the last webinar in the series, this one is all about staying ahead of the curve, really. So once you roll out your phase 1, 2, 3 of your implementation of Microsoft Purview, or maybe some additional tools or whatever it is, you want to look at that compliance as a life cycle. It's not just sort of a one and done type of thing, and that path forward, right? So the next webinar focuses on like strategies to maintain that momentum, looks at how to proactively handle emergent challenges, how to refine your data governance programs, all of those sorts of things, right? Also, I mentioned this very briefly, but we're going to tackle looking at how to respond to new regulations, right? New regulations, changing regulations means you might have to change a label or a policy within the organization, and how are you able to respond to that? And then just general sort of building resilience, right? And practical steps for incident response planning, audits, all of that sort of stuff. And really it comes down to kind of, future-proofing your organization. Again, it's really not about just doing this once and kind of forgetting about it. It is an ongoing thing. It is something that all organizations need to kind of pay attention to and implement a proper data governance framework so that they can mitigate risks as much as possible. Thanks for your time today. Let's check and see if there are any questions in the Q&A. Looks like we don't have any questions from the audience at this point, so we will end the webinar there. Thank you everyone for your time today, and hope you have a good day. Thank you.